During his short life, and especially after his death, the reputation of Germanicus was unequaled. To his soldiers, his bravery and skill as a commander inspired them to victory even under the most dire circumstances. For the common citizen, he was the one man they hoped could bring long-cherished democracy back to the former republic. Germanicus was born with the name Nero Claudius Drusus in 16 BC into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which was the first Roman imperial dynasty. His father, Drusus Sr., had been a successful general in his own right, winning praise for his victorious campaigns against the barbarian tribes in Germania. In September 9 BC, Drusus Sr. died from injuries sustained from falling from his horse. He was honored by the Roman Senate, and all of his male descendants were given the honorary name of Germanicus. Nero Claudius Drusus was adopted by his uncle Tiberius in 4 AD, and his name was changed to Germanicus Julius Caesar. Germanicus simply meant the German, but it conveyed a powerful and emotive image to the Roman public. To them, it showed a great Roman military commander as victor over savage warriors in the wild and untamed land of rivers, swamps, and forests of faraway Germania. Germanicus was recognized at a young age by his superiors as an intelligent and talented military leader. He was able to take on increasing responsibility and also maintain control when given progressively larger groups of men to command. At age 21, he was first charged by Emperor Augustus with forming a military unit for deployment during a large-scale rebellion in the province of Illyricum. His challenge was to gather a group of citizens and freed slaves and train them into a battle-ready fighting unit. In its first operational season in 7 AD, the unit proved effective in defeating the Mizay tribe in the lowlands of Bosnia-Herzegovina. It was a great achievement considering Germanicus had no leadership training for the role he was asked to perform. Having impressed his adoptive father Tiberius, Germanicus was given greater responsibility and placed in charge of regular legions and cohorts the following year in Croatia. During the campaign, he was acclaimed imperator by his men as a mark of their gratitude towards him. After the war, he was among the victorious senior commanders, honored with a triumph. In 9 AD, one of the most humiliating and crushing defeats Imperial Rome would ever suffer occurred in Germany's Teutoburg Forest. Roman general Publius Quinctilius Varus had lost his life, and 3 full legions of Roman troops were slaughtered. Over 20,000 Romans were brutally butchered on the battlefield, ambushed by an endless sea of Germanic tribesmen. The Germanic leader was a chieftain and former Roman ally named Arminius. He secretly planned a revolt against Roman rule that culminated in his defeat of the Roman army at Teutoburg. Right after the disaster at Teutoburg, Germanicus was placed in command of the remaining Rhine army units on the German border while Tiberius sought guidance from Emperor Augustus. Having won his adoptive father's confidence, his mentorship under Tiberius continued when he accompanied him on a campaign into Germania in 11 AD. Augustus promoted Germanicus to governor of Triskalia in 13 AD. During his tenure, he put down an insurrection of Gallic rebels, restoring order to the province. As envoy of the emperor, he assumed full responsibility for the army in the 2 Germanies, which represented a third of all Rome's legionary troops and auxiliary cohorts. After Augustus died in 14 AD, he acted quickly to face down a mutiny of Roman citizen soldiers in his jurisdiction. He listened to their grievances and dealt with the issues of pay and conditions. With bad feeling lingering in the ranks, he recognized that the need to rebuild unit cohesion was urgent, and led them in a raid across the Rhine River. The attack on Rome's barbarian enemies had the desired effect. The raid became a first step to a larger mission into Germania. Germanicus was invested by the emperor with the power to take such actions as necessary to safeguard the borders of his territory. Tiberius, who was now the emperor, allowed the raid despite the advice he received from Augustus not to expand the boundaries of the empire. He led an army of 12,000 Roman legions, 26 infantry cohorts, and 8 mounted cohorts across the Rhine into Germania in 14 AD. The Germanic tribes were unprepared for the Roman incursion, as they were still celebrating the prolonged absence of Roman forces during the mourning of the death of Augustus, and also from the military insurrection. Germanicus's forces first surrounded and destroyed a village of the Marsi tribe, sparing no one. He next ordered his legions to devastate the region for 50 miles around, leveling everything sacred or profane to the German tribes to the ground. It could hardly be described as a glorious victory, but the point of the raid was to provide a means for his troops to redeem themselves and to rebuild unit cohesion after the divisive events of the previous weeks. For that reason, he was successful. The neighboring Germanic tribes soon learned of the general slaughter unleashed upon the Marsi and prepared to attack the Romans on their return to the Rhine. However, Germanicus had anticipated this and prepared his forces accordingly. The allied tribes attacked the marching Roman troops in their most vulnerable area, but Germanicus personally rode up to his men on horseback, rallied them, and pushed the attackers back for good. The Romans managed to survive the attack and set up camp for the season before winter took over. By the end of the year, Germanicus had returned to Rome as a hero. The word of his exploits in putting down the mutiny and invading Germania reached the city well before he arrived. He had restored much of the prestige of the Roman army that had been squashed in the disaster years earlier in the Teutoburg Forest. In spring 15 AD, Germanicus invaded Germania again, launching a two-pronged assault on the Chatti nation. After a quick advance through enemy territory, he located the enemy tribe, and the encounter was a bloody and brutal affair. Most of the tribe was killed or captured after the able-bodied men fled from the invading Roman army. After regrouping, the Chatti warriors fared no better after attempting to stop the rampaging Roman forces. They soon attempted to negotiate for peace, but Germanicus refused, leaving them no choice but to surrender or flee into the vast surrounding woodlands. Left undefended, the Romans razed the Chattian settlements to the ground at will, including their tribal capital of Matium. The Roman army continued on, marching deeper into Germania, temporarily establishing itself in a fort built by Germanicus's father decades earlier. With the spring offensive concluded, his new mission would address the continuing threat posed by Arminius, now the undisputed head of the Cherusci nation. Some Cherusci believed that there was more to be gained from an alliance with Rome than remaining independent. The anti-Roman faction led by Arminius and the pro-Roman faction headed by a noble named Segestus had grown far apart. Complicating matters, these two men were bound by family ties. Segestus was Arminius's unwilling father-in-law by way of marriage to his daughter Thusnelda. Prior to the Battle of Teutoburg, he had warned Varus that his son-in-law was planning a rebellion, but was ignored in favor of their seemingly loyal ally, Arminius. Years later, Segestus remained loyal to Rome and continuously fed intelligence back to his partners across the Rhine. Germanicus learned that the old man was living day to day under the constant threat of imprisonment or death by those in his community supporting Arminius, who still sought war with Rome. Germanicus soon devised a rescue mission, and after a struggle, Roman forces located and rescued Segestus. He also captured Arminius's pregnant wife, Thusnelda, and took them back to Roman territory. Her capture was a huge accomplishment for Germanicus. He now had his main adversary's wife, but as she was pregnant, also his child. Importantly, his soldiers found plunder and spoils stolen from Varus and his army 6 years before. Segestus thanked Germanicus, who in turn assured him that he, his daughter, and his grandchild would be looked after while in Roman territory for the rest of their lives. After hearing of his wife's capture, Arminius declared total war on the Romans and began preparations for attack on Germanicus's forces. The Romans had recently crossed back over the Rhine River from their time back in Italy. Germanicus had anticipated an attack and launched a preemptive strike on German territory with 3 different army groups to surround and isolate the Cherusci. Germanicus himself would lead an amphibious invasion that would deliver his troops directly to the estuary of the Ems River, where they would march southeast, following the course of the river. 4 legions made up his army group, among which were auxiliaries from allied Germanic tribes. With Germanicus's forces were survivors of the disaster of 9 AD, men who were denied the right to return to Italy and knew the lay of the land and what to expect when they traversed it. The war to topple Arminius had begun wholeheartedly. After successful incursions into German territory, the 3 army groups eventually joined up close to the site of the infamous Teutoburg disaster. Veering from his campaign plan, Germanicus felt compelled to visit the place where so many Romans had fallen and whose bones were thought to still lie unburied. Guided by the survivors of the massacre, they found the battle site. He assembled the men and announced that their countrymen would be honored with a tumulus, a sacred mound of earth. Germanicus himself laid the first pile of dirt. They began collecting and bringing the scattered bones to a place of burial. It was an emotional moment for all gathered at the grim location. Germanicus channeled the collective sorrow and rage of the Romans into an act of communal piety. With his men unified in common cause, Germanicus gave the order to march on. Their mission was to hunt down the man responsible for the slaughter of their countrymen. Arminius's men were close by and launched an ambush on the Roman column from the cover of the forest. The surprise attack temporarily caused panic for the Romans, but Germanicus arrived just in time with his legions to stave off the attack. The two forces separated after a brief engagement, with Germanicus's timely arrival saving the Romans from disaster. Mindful that the campaigning season was entering its final days, Germanicus decided it was time to call for a general withdrawal. His expeditionary force was now deep inside Germania, and the Rhine was hundreds of miles away. Germanicus led his army group on the sea transports back to Roman territory. He then ordered the second army group to take the more direct overland route back to the Rhine. On the way back, they were attacked by Arminius, but he was repulsed again. After a heroic struggle, the Romans pushed on and made their way back successfully to the Rhine. The third army group followed the shoreline and was eventually picked up by Germanicus's transports, but only after fateful mistakes due to the ebb and flow of the tides, which trapped and drowned many of their men. All three army groups were finally back at their base across the Rhine River. Despite the embarrassing mishaps of the return journey, overall the campaign in Germania had been successful. The Chatti and Cherusci had been roundly defeated, and arch-villain Arminius had been humiliated. Segestes and his pro-Roman entourage had been rescued. The story would play well with the home crowd, who were eager to erase the humiliation of the Teutoburg disaster. At the start of 16 AD, Germanicus planned a new campaign to achieve a total victory against Arminius, once and for all. Back across the Rhine, he first encountered the army of Arminius at the Battle of the Weser River. Germanicus decided to retreat after a costly opening assault against Arminius had failed. Next, at the Battle of Edistaviso, Arminius's men charged in hard, hoping to score a quick victory against the Roman forces. However, the sudden sight of 8 eagles flying overhead had inspired the Romans to fight off the assault. As the bird of Jupiter and the iconic emblem carried by each of the legions, the eagle had great significance for the Romans. The morale of the Roman army had lifted, and the enemy assault was beaten back for good, with Arminius nearly captured after getting wounded in battle. The Germanic forces were massacred, while the Romans suffered slight casualties. The war might have ended there, but the Germanic alliance under Arminius chose to make a last stand to avenge their humiliation at Edistaviso. At the Battle of the Angravarian Wall, the two forces met each other for the decisive clash of the war. The Germanic tribes had created a defensive earthwork and hoped to ambush the Roman attackers at their rear from a nearby forest. Arminius had hoped the Romans would become bogged down from attacking the heavily defended wall. Germanicus had discovered the plan and split his troops to deal with the anticipated strategy by Arminius. Always leading from the front, he decided to lead the more difficult assault on the heavily guarded wall. The battle soon commenced, and both sides became bogged down in difficult terrain, and it soon turned into brutal hand-to-hand fighting. To turn the tide of the battle, Germanicus ripped off his helmet so that his men could see his face. He urged the men around him to fight on, take no prisoners, but continue the slaughter until the Germanic army was completely destroyed. Fired up by their commander's words, and seeing him personally engaged in the fight, the wary and bloodied Roman troops fought on. Eventually, the persistent Romans cut their way through the enemy lines and pushed the Germanic forces back. Arminius finally gave up the fight and fled with his life, and with him went the survivors of the allied Germanic armies. When the last of the tribesmen had retreated from the field, the Romans proclaimed victory. Before the invasion, Germanicus had set his mind on bringing Germania to heel for the glory of Rome. However, it was near the end of campaign season, and the Romans began to make their way back home. In the end, Germanicus had completely defeated Arminius and his many allied Germanic tribes. Importantly, he also recovered 2 of Varus's 3 eagle standards lost at Teutoburg since his time in Germania. The bitter defeat of Teutoburg had finally been expunged and Roman honor restored. Only at the end of 16 AD did Emperor Tiberius intervene to prevent further actions after he decided the investment was too high for the gains achieved and those being promised. Germanicus pleaded for further action in Germania to achieve total victory, but finally accepted the decision by his commander-in-chief and adoptive father. Germanicus returned to Rome as a hero and was given a triumphal parade in May 17 AD. In 18 AD, he was given supreme authority over the Eastern Roman Empire by Tiberius. Germanicus stayed in the eastern part of the empire until he mysteriously died in Syria in October 19 AD. He is thought to have been poisoned by a rival named Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, who was governor of the Syrian province. The death of Germanicus in the midst of his promising career kept him from becoming the emperor. However, he still influenced history for the next 50 years, not only from the reputation he built when he was alive, but also from his role as the father of one emperor, Caligula, the brother of another, Claudius, and the grandfather of a third, Nero.